Good evening. Miraculous, thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Lords, ladies and gentlemen, sorry. Good evening. Welcome to the Oxford University Museum of Natural History. My name is John Krebs, and I'm the chairman of the visitors of the Natural History Museum, and standing here in that capacity. In case you hadn't noticed, it's a birthday today, not just Abraham Lincoln, but also Charles Darwin. And this event this evening is part of the worldwide celebration of Charles Darwin's birthday. And it's a joint event organized by the Natural History Museum, the Institute of Biology, together with the Bodleian Library and Oxford Philmusica. And my job is simply to introduce the chairman of the conversation, but also to thank Raymond Dweck, who's helped to make all this happen, and Amy Sewell from the Development Office, who has also played a key role. And I just want to make a few housekeeping announcements before I hand over to the conversation. Sorry about this, but I have to go through it. Number one, if you hear the fire alarm, I hope you don't, a continuous alarm, the instructions say, leave the building quickly and calmly through the nearest available escape route. There are 2 staircases from the gallery on the north and south ends. Have you got your compass with you? Do not stop to pick up your personal belongings. Report to the fire assembly point in the front lawn in front of the building, and do not re-enter until authorized to do so. So that's fire. The next thing is mobile phones. If this was the cinema, I'd suddenly have that background noise of phones ringing, but I can't do that, so please do switch off your mobile phones now. And the final point to say, got cameras, but please no photographs during the conversation. The conversation is being filmed and will be available on the university website, as well as a podcast on the Guardian podcast website. So those are my introductory housekeeping remarks, and it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Jeremy Paxman, who is going to moderate the conversation. Jeremy, it says that I'm supposed to introduce you, but you need no introduction, and so I simply hand over to you to introduce the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I wouldn't worry too much about the health and safety announcements. The chances of a fire 2 days running in the same place are extremely remote. When I was invited by John to come along this evening, I was under the impression we were recreating the Huxley-Wilberforce debate of 1860, which, although it seems in history to have had such a profound effect, very few people were able to provide any kind of accurate record of at the time, or indeed 30 years afterwards. You'll recall that in that debate, Soapy Sam Wilberforce, not played by the bishop on my left, asked Huxley whether he was descended from an ape on his grandfather's side or his mother's side, and Huxley is supposed to have replied, although I don't think with any evidence, he'd rather be descended from an ape than a bishop, but actually claimed to be able to remember only afterwards that he'd said he would rather be descended from an ape than to use his talents to obscure an obvious truth. I was rather alarmed and therefore accused of being a typical trivial media type to discover that both Richards have agreed that they're going to have a civilized conversation between them this evening, which will include no such invective. I therefore rather rely upon you to inject as much controversy as you like. And I was rather struck with the remark that Huxley made, because he was actually rather reluctant to appear the first time he was invited. He felt that a general audience in which sentiment would unduly interfere with intellect was not the public before which such a discussion should take place. Now, this will, of course, not apply in your cases, and you're free to ask any questions you like preferably as difficult or indeed as rude or repeated as you wish, of either of our protagonists. But as you've come to this friendly stitch-up between you, who have you decided will go first?
We haven't talked about it.
We haven't talked about it.
Well, I don't think so. Stand up in a court of law, you know. Right, well, I think you could start then, Richard.
Winston Churchill said, "History will be kind to me. I intend to write it." And I think something of that went on this occasion, because the main account that we have of this seems to have come from Huxley, and he, of course, gave a good account. Other people felt that Hooker was actually the one, Sir Joseph Hooker was actually the one who trounced Bishop Wilberforce. Bishop Wilberforce himself was of a different opinion, as we saw in the Divinity School just now, looking at the manuscripts that were kindly laid out for us. He wrote a letter to somebody saying that he just got back from having a discussion with Professor Huxley, and he said, "I feel that I beat him thoroughly." So we have at least three completely separate, conflicting accounts of this debate. I have to confess that I've always regarded this debate between Huxley and Wilberforce as a bit of a bore. I'm more interested in the issues than in winning debating points. And so I'm looking forward to getting on to that with Richard later.
Yes, well, I'm very happy to get on to any issue you want, Richard, but I think it is important to put the historical record straight, as you have begun to do. The great myth of religion opposed to science originated 40 years later in a story in the Gentleman's Magazine. It's a wonderful story. Nobody could resist it then, and nobody can resist it now. The truth is very different. The so-called big encounter was not a big encounter. It was a side meeting. Neither Wilberforce nor Huxley were billed as the main speakers. It wasn't advertised in advance. They were just called on to speak. And as you rightly say, the main intellectual force for Darwin at the time was actually Joseph Hooker. But a very brief word about Wilberforce himself. He was no slouch. He'd got first in maths. He had a very keen interest in natural science. He was vice president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. He'd written a 39-page detailed review of the origin of species in the Quarterly Review, which Darwin said was uncommonly clever and had picked up all the weak points in his argument. So he was no slouch. And of course, what we have to remember, this is very important, most of the best-known scientists at the time opposed Darwin. So in Wilberforce, in opposing Darwin, was really standing on the side of what you might call the conventional science of the time. Now, I think most objective observers of this occasion did think that Wilberforce had lost it, not on the grounds of science, but the fact that actually he came across rather badly, and he wasn't very popular with Oxford dons. And I think it was Huxley's son who said that actually it was a kind of failure of manners that he had lost it.
As for as for Wilberforce's review of the origin, and also indeed perhaps his performance at this discussion, it's widely believed that it was written by Richard Owen. And that's where, when you say he was no slouch, Richard Owen was no slouch.
No.
And we don't know, I think, how much of Wilberforce's review was written by Owen.
Did he believe in the creation myth?
Wilberforce?
Yes.
Yes, I think he did, as, of course, did the majority of scientists at the time. They thought that all species were created, as it were, ready-made. That was the prevailing view at the time.
Do you believe it?
No, I don't. No.
Why not?
Simply because all that evolutionary biologists have shown us about the whole process of evolution, right from the origin of the universe 13.7 billion years ago, and everything that has taken place there since then, particularly on this earth, which Richard has written about so wonderfully in his books. It's a wonderful, wonderful story. That, there's no doubt in my mind, that is true.
I think it's wonderful that Richard should say that, and probably most of your...
Very perceptive fellow.
Most of your colleagues in the Church of England, at least, would probably say the same. But I must say, I wish you guys would get out there and do something about your congregations, because it's not enough to say a few bishops and theologians support evolution. Of course they do. But the vast majority, at least in the United States, and increasingly here, of the people in the pew, and even more on the prayer mat, are simple Genesis-believing, naive young earth creationists. And that's very worrying and ought to worry bishops, at least as much as scientists. And I wonder whether you think that you and your colleagues are doing enough to correct the misconceptions among your flocks. And I don't mean just positively, I think I also mean standing up in the pulpit and preaching a sermon in which you may refer to Adam and Eve and the fall. And if anybody challenges you, you'll say, oh, of course, it's only an allegory, it's only symbolic, it's only metaphorical. But how many of the congregation know it's only an allegory? And that's what worries me, because there's this kind of tendency for preachers generally to assume that everybody knows that what they're talking about is symbolic and allegorical, and overlook the fact that their audience is actually taking it literally. As
Why does that matter, though?
Because it's false.
Well, why does that matter? Some credulous fools choose to believe something that is untrue. Why does it matter?
Because they're missing such an enormous amount, because the truth is so wonderful and so exciting, as Richard will agree.
Yes, and also it's because a literalistic view of the Bible totally misunderstands what the Bible is about. And it is important to understand that the Bible is a particular kind of literature which conveys particular kinds of truth through poetry, through myth, and through story. And I think it's very important to people to understand what the Bible is about. But I can assure you, Richard, I preached on Darwin last Sunday, straight down the line.
You probably wrote that for him too.
And I think probably most members of the Church of England do have no problem at all believing in the theory of evolution. I did get one very furious email afterwards, and I had to write back and say that, you know, with all respect, I just couldn't believe, didn't think there could be a meeting of minds, because her fundamental premises were so different from mine. But you're quite right, it is a worrying situation in the country. The latest opinion polls show that only about 50% of the population believe in the theory of evolution, and certainly amongst young evangelical Christians and young Muslims, there is still a strong creationist belief. Teachers find that in schools, apparently. That's why this whole question of whether creationism should be taught in schools has arisen so sharply, because apart from anything else, teachers have found in their science classes there are people who actually take that view.
Well, that is very worrying.
It is worrying.
And you and I have, of course, collaborated in trying to do something about that. But I want to come back to what you were saying about what the Bible really is, what Genesis really is. It's symbolic, it's mythical, it's poetic. That's a convenient thing to say in the 21st century, and because that's the best you can say of it. But do you think the authors thought it was? I mean, didn't the people who wrote Genesis believe it?
Well, I think that the authors who wrote what we call the Bible were very well aware that the Bible contains many different kinds of literature. I mean, obviously, apart from the else, you've got letters in it, the letters of St. Paul. You've got biographies, the Gospels. In the Torah, the Hebrew Scripture, you've got laws for living of all kinds.
No, but talk about Genesis, because that's...
Well, Genesis, I think it'd be true to say that many of the patristic fathers, people like Augustine, Well, first of all, they thought that what we would call the literal interpretation of the Bible was not the most important. The most important was the allegorical and the spiritual and the moral, the spiritual and moral truths you got from it. So they weren't interested so much in the literal side. And St. Augustine, for example, like a lot of other people, thought that when Genesis referred to day, of course it wasn't the human kind of day. It was a God's kind of day, which was a very, very long time. So it wasn't what we would call a straightforward literalism.
When Jesus told parables, there's no question about it. He knew that it was a parable he was telling, and he didn't expect his audience to take it literally. He knew it was a parable. But although Augustine may well have interpreted Genesis as an allegory, how did he know, and how do you know, that the Bronze Age anonymous authors who originally, well, it came from Babylonian myths, I think. It doesn't seem plausible to me that you can automatically assume that because something is a holy book, that the authors of it intended it to be allegorical, when most people who read it throughout history have interpreted it literally. And why wouldn't you interpret it literally?
Well, anybody who does literature knows that any piece of literature gets reinterpreted in every generation, and what we receive is always a reinterpretation of a reinterpretation of a reinterpretation. That is the nature of literature. And it doesn't really, frankly, matter so much what they meant, if that is ever recoverable, and that is really rather doubtful. What is much more important is what we actually think it means to us today. And that account in the book of Genesis, from a religious point of view, is saying that the whole universe, moment by moment, is dependent upon a power beyond itself. And there is an ultimate divine fiat, which is expressed in that kind of story way. You and I have just had the privilege of listening to a wonderful performance of Haydn's Creation, which I think was specially put on for your honor, Richard, because we knew that you'd want to begin this evening by listening to some words of Scripture and hearing how wonderful they were. Now, listening to that's not science. But it is saying, first of all, there is something awesome and wonderful about the universe, which I know you believe in very strongly. And I'd like to get on that at some point, because you've described yourself in public on film as, in some sense, a deeply religious man. And I'm sure that for you, as for me, in Haydn's Creation, something of that sense of awe and wonder before the universe was expressed.
My feeling was that even the wonderful music of Haydn couldn't disguise the banality of the words that we were listening to. We need great poetry to express the wonder of the universe, but Genesis isn't it. Or if it is, there's nothing special about it. You could go to the origin myths of any people, ask any anthropologist.
But I think I disagree with you on literary grounds there. Let there be light. And God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. You can't do better than that.
I think we're just going to have to agree to differ on that.
Is there a problem for you as a bishop in telling your congregation, or what is it bishops have? Dioceses, don't they? I mean, anyway, telling your flock that part of the Bible is clearly not meant to be believed, and parts apparently are meant to be believed.
Which is which? Yeah.
Yes.
Well, people believe things in different ways.
But it's not true. I mean, you've just said.
Well, there are different kinds of truth. There are moral truths, there's spiritual truths, there's the truths of history, and there are the truths of science. The Bible is not about the truths of science. It does contain some historical truths, but it fundamentally contains some religious truths written from the standpoint of Judaism and Christianity, that there is something very special about us human beings, that we are made in the image of God. That is the sense we can think and know that we're thinking, we can choose, we're conscious of moral choice, we can pray, and that there is an ultimately wise rationality behind this universe who desires to enter into a relationship with us. That's what the Bible is
Well, is the
about.
resurrection a myth as well?
I don't believe the resurrection is a myth. No, I
Is
believe
the virgin birth a myth?
the virgin birth could be interpreted either way, and I'm not bothered too much about that. I mean, I do take historical fact very seriously, but clearly some proclamations of Christianity are more important than others. And the resurrection is absolutely fundamental.
How do you decide? I mean, because it's all there in the Bible. You arbitrarily say, I'm going to believe that one, but not that one. That one's symbolic. That one I believe. That one's borderline.
Well, I'm not
decides?
talking at the moment about whether it is true or not. I'm talking about whether it's important that it's true. That's the only point that I was making there. It is absolutely fundamental to Christianity that the resurrection of Christ, in some sense, some very real sense, is profoundly true. I believe that if that was not the case, then it would not be possible to be a Christian believer. So I do take very seriously the importance of certain alleged in inverted commas, historical facts. When I put it in inverted commas, because clearly the resurrection is both within history and out of history. It's not totally containable within what we call historical criteria and parameters.
But you seem to be saying that
we seem to be getting onto religion rather than science. I think we need to getting off creation.
No, but you're the one who articulated this argument that these two things were not incompatible.
Yeah.
We're just getting into some other areas where they might be incompatible.
Well,
I've not come across any other resurrections. Maybe. Go on, Richard.
Well, let's get on to science then, shall we?
Yeah.
Shall we? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. When you say that, and of course I agree with you that the universe is wonderful and great and awe-inspiring, I find that I get that from science, and the more I learn about science, the more wonderful it is. And then if I go and read something from not just the Bible, but really any piece of sacred text, any piece of anthropological speculation, I find that I'm brought down to earth with a bang. It suddenly ceases to be so grand, it becomes rather petty, rather small. It's of course interesting from a historical point of view that people have believed these things, and every tribe in the world believes different things. There is a certain interest in it, but it doesn't even begin to measure up to the scale of the universe. That's what I meant when I said that even Haydn couldn't really redeem the words of the creation that we were listening to. It's small, it's petty, it's diminished. If only Haydn had lived a century or so later and could have written the Evolution Oratorio.
But wouldn't you say that all the things which you regard as small and petty, leaving aside whether that's a correct judgment, do clearly reflect our human limitations to grasp the majesty and wonder of the universe? Because I'd put it to you, if you feel like this about the universe, which you clearly do, if there was a fountain origin of the universe, then that fountain and origin must by definition be even more awesome and wonderful, however inadequate the limitations of our attempts to grasp and express that.
Yes, indeed, and that's one of the reasons why I don't believe it, but we could come on to that later.
Sorry, what you don't...
Well, when you say fount...
Yes, but all I'm asking you to say yay or nay to is that you clearly have this profound sense of wonder and awe before the beauty and the complexity of the universe. All I'm suggesting to you that if there was a wise rationality behind all this, which caused it all to come into being, which moment by moment holds it in existence, then by definition, that wise intelligence would be even more awesome and wonderful. If there was,
Yes,
that's all I'm saying. I'm not putting in the same corner of saying, but if there was.
What I meant was that my reason for not believing in it is precisely that something, that an intelligence capable of designing something so wonderful would exactly, in your words, have to be even more wonderful. That means even more improbable. Now, the biggest legacy, I think, that Darwin has given us, it's not just in biology. What Darwin has given us is a way of explaining how you can start from ultimate simplicity, the simple beginnings of the universe, the simple beginnings of life, and build up to it by slow, steady, intelligible steps to all the wonders that we see. That's what science does. Science explains how you can get these wonderful things if you start from something simple. Now, if you start from something complex, like an intelligence, then you've sold the pass. You have smuggled in a non-explanation disguised as an explanation. That was the point I was trying to make in answer to you there.
But I would suggest that by definition, if there was a wise intelligence behind it all, then by definition, that wise intelligence must contain within himself or herself the whole of the complexity which has emerged in creation.
But it's so improbable that you would get that.
To say something that's either probable or improbable, you must have some examples, but we don't have an example to say it's either probable or improbable. There's only one universe here
Let's look at what Darwin actually did. Darwin showed that you can get complexity, you can get brains, eyes, wings, intestines, hearts. You can get all these beautiful and wonderful complex things starting from almost nothing, starting from molecules in the primeval soup and then going back before that. That is a stupendous feat of explanation. That's what Darwin did. That shows us what can be done by science in explaining the existence of complicated, awe-inspiring things, starting from simple things which don't need so much of an explanation. They still need an explanation, but not such a big explanation. The big explanation, which before Darwin came along, Paley and everybody else, as you said, there had to be an intelligence, as they thought, because it is so complicated. Darwin showed that you can get from simplicity to complexity by slow, steady, intelligible, gradual steps. That seems to me to undercut the whole argument for an intelligence that lies behind it. You could say, oh, well, God just decided that natural selection and evolution was the way to do it, was the way he was going to do his creation. That means that he chose the one method of doing it, which made him unnecessary.
But you still have to face the issue that from this extraordinary simplicity at the beginning, there has emerged this whole complex process leading up to human minds which can enter into and understand the ordered processes of the whole system of evolution. This surely is quite extraordinary, that something as simple as basic matter should have eventually produced you and me and Jeremy sitting here. And the theory of evolution itself can't explain that.
Yes,
it can't explain how that simplicity was there in the first place, a simplicity which, as it were, had all this complexity built into it.
It wasn't built in. There had to be an initial simplicity, and that does need an explanation, and that's something that physicists are working on. It's something that I can't help with. But it was simple. However difficult it may be to explain something simple, it's a hell of a lot more difficult to explain something complex.
But would you agree that there are two kinds of explanatory theory? There's one which tries to describe a process of how something is coming about, which scientists do in their laboratories. But there is another kind of explanatory theory. When you go home or I go home, and we wonder about the experience of beauty or love or the pain of life, and we wonder what the heck's it all about. Now, you're not going to get a scientific explanation to that. You're going to get an answer that either there is a purpose, or there isn't a purpose, or we don't know. But it's a totally different it's a totally different question, requiring a totally different answer. And what goes into making up of that answer is not just what you discover in the laboratory. It's your experience of beauty, it's your experience of moral struggle, experience of human relationships, experience of love, of evil. All these go into trying to see whether there is answer. I'm not saying there is answer, but it's just, I'd like you to acknowledge that there is a different kind of question which requires a different kind of answer.
I will acknowledge that science is not, at least at present, capable of providing a fully satisfactory explanation for feelings of love and beauty, the overwhelming feeling from reading a Shakespeare sonnet or something like that. I will accept that. What I will not accept is that religion provides any better an explanation than science does of that. These are mysterious things at present. They're mysteries which I at least believe science in principle can solve. Maybe it won't ever in practice solve, but in principle, you do not add anything to your understanding of a love of beauty or happiness or just plain love by injecting a supernatural creator. That doesn't help. We've still got a mystery. We've still got a mystery that we're working on, and it's very difficult.
But I think, with due respect, you're not facing the issue that there are certain kinds of question which can only be answered or addressed in terms of whether there is a purpose or not a purpose. If I reach forward now and take that glass of water and somebody says, what happened? You get a description of what happened. If you say, well, why does he reach forward to take that glass of water? The answer, presumably, is a personal answer. I was thirsty, or I chose to do it. This is a different question which requires a different kind of answer.
It is a different question, but I'm really surprised that you think it needs a religious answer, because...
well, let me, if I may, point to your own writings. I think, if I might say so, the bits of the God delusion that are particularly helpful are when you write about morality. Now, what I gain from this is that although you think a capacity for moral choice or moral discrimination is in some sense built into us, we're not tied down by simply what nature's given us, because our moral sense becomes, as it were, enculturated. It takes cultural form through poetry, through the choices we make. Now, this seems to me to indicate that you're concerned about culture and human purpose, and not just what the evolutionary process has given us.
Yes, I mean, of course I am.
And if you're willing to do that in principle about morality, why wouldn't you, in principle, allow it to do it with the possibility of a spiritual, an ultimate spiritual meaning to life? I'm not arguing there is, just to hold open the possibility that it might be there. It's a legitimate question.
If by spiritual you mean poetic, artistic, subjective, all those things I accept and regard as manifestations of brain activity which we don't yet understand. If by purpose you say you mean some kind of ultimate purpose, what is the ultimate purpose of the universe, I don't think it's a legitimate question. I mean, it seems to me that we are beings who have been conditioned throughout our lives to ask purpose-type questions. It's easy to say my purpose in reaching for a glass of water is I want to drink. I mean, that's pure brain stuff. That's not a problem. If you say, what is the purpose of the universe? What is the ultimate purpose of the world? Then I would simply say that's not a legitimate question. It's not a question that deserves an answer.
But it seems to me that a logical consequence of the view you're taking is that this very conversation which we're having together, as it were, has been built into the natural process, where for me it is a discussion about the possibility of truth or different kinds of truth. It's not just been built into us by nature. It's not predetermined and pre-selected. There are possibilities open of moving forward or moving somewhere
I think
new.
we're just saying that humans are very complicated, and we have complicated conversations and social relations and culture, and that doesn't mean that ultimately there's not a scientific explanation. It may be one that we'll never
But
get.
can I point also to your search for scientific truth, and particularly Darwin? I mean, Darwin was a very good person. We're certainly agreed on that. Man of enormous integrity, painstaking in the research he did, driven by the desire to get at the truth of things, and so are you. Now, this is much more than simply that something has been built into our bodies. It's more than simply activity going on in the brain. It's something else altogether.
Well, how do you know?
Well, let me ask you whether your desire for truth it's obviously important to you. And I'm sure you wouldn't want to think of it simply in terms of grain activity. Of course, there is activity going on. You would? Right.
I mean, I can't think what else it would be. I mean, that doesn't make it any less...
Well, of course, it's activity going on in the brain, but when you go into the lab, you don't think just, well, there's a lot of funny activity going on in my brain today. You're actually trying to,
you don't think that, of course.
No, you're totally involved in what you're trying to do.
Of course, and similarly, when you fall in love, when you listen to music, you don't think, oh, think of all those neurons firing away. I mean, we are human, but that doesn't mean that if we're challenged to say, does the existence of a love of poetry and music and other people imply some kind of supernatural? No, it doesn't.
Well, I think we're going to have to differ there. And do you think we ought to let somebody
Okay, let's have some
let
questions
somebody
from
else?
Thursday. Well, you go on. You have to speak up a bit.
Yeah, I think we are missing the point in this discussion because it's about Darwinism, and we won't come out of here knowing anything more than we knew when we entered into this debate. We are talking about things that are in the best of the side. Now, the way I see it is, Darwin didn't invent evolution. He came to a state where there was already the concept of evolution. His contribution was to say how the evolution works. And I would like to hear here from the speakers, the honorable speakers, what do they think Darwin contributed in this explanation of how the evolution works?
Okay.
I think that's for
Because I know that there are very critical views that say that in his words, he really was wrong.
Richard?
Darwin didn't invent evolution, obviously, that's an old idea. He didn't even invent natural selection. There were other people who thought of natural selection. What I think that Darwin, and actually Wallace as well, did was to recognize that natural selection is the powerful driving force which pushes evolution in the direction of adaptation, in the direction of improvement, in the direction of beauty, and everything that creates an illusion of design. So there were others who had the sort of essential ideas, but Darwin and Wallace were the only people who saw the significance of it and realized that it was the answer to the great riddle of the existence of life. Now, when you say there are severe critics of Darwin, obviously Darwin got some things wrong because, he lived a century and a half ago. But I don't know of any serious critics who will say...
The system is
well,
gradual.
The system is gradual insofar as anything that matters. There is a certain amount of controversy about whether it's the so-called theory of evolution by jerks, whether evolution goes in abrupt steps sometimes. There is a certain amount of evidence in the fossil record that this can happen, but it's not a big deal. It doesn't detract from the fundamental point that evolution is gradual insofar as it explains the origin of complex apparent design.
Okay, let's have another question. Yes, you sir.
The
Mr. Dawkins has held up the prospect that things like the experience of music or the experience of love might be explained by science. But it seems to me, when you accepted that the ultimate question of what's the ultimate purpose of any of these things is a bad question, one we ought not to ask, that leaves us as humans in a rather uncomfortable position. Because as your work has shown, we can give an account of how there's this special thing humans can do, which is to think about our purposes and decide which purposes to have and which purposes not to have. And we often do that by pushing the purposes further and further back. But if the scientific story, the lesson of the explanation of purpose by evolution and natural selection, is that there's no way of answering any of these ultimate purpose questions, then it makes us very uncomfortable as people that are deciding between our purposes. Now, maybe we just have to live with that, but I wonder if you've got anything more to say about that. One of the things that religion has as an advertisement is an answer to that question.
If you feel uncomfortable, then that's just tough. Because something is uncomfortable, it doesn't make it untrue. Anybody who says religion makes you feel comfortable, therefore it's true, is obviously putting forward a logical non sequitur. Now, I don't feel all that uncomfortable, and I'm not quite sure why you do. I'm quite happy to live my life as a human being, to forget that as I love and listen to music and all those nice things, that to forget that it is neurons firing that are making me have those feelings. Of course I don't do that. Of course I'm an ordinary human being who feels the same way as anybody else. I do not know that science will ultimately ever explain those things, but I'm pretty sure that if science can't explain them, nothing else can.
Yes, sir.
I was a little disturbed, a lot disturbed at the beginning when discussing allegories and figurative statements, for example, Genesis, and the idea was, well, what's true and what's not true? The idea of an allegory is not a question of true and not true. I happen to love Aesop's fables. One of the most famous ones, the fox and the grapes. Well, no one says, well, it's a total lie. Foxes don't lie. Foxes don't do grapes. And this particular fox never did anything. It's a lie. That's not what it means. Of course, it factually didn't occur, but it is a truth because it's a description of human behavior in an allegorical form. Now, it's not a question of what's true and what's not true. It's how you understand the presentation of this truth. Is it literal or is it allegory? They're both true at the same time.
Do you want to deal with it?
Aesop knew that what he was saying in his fables was an allegory. Aesop was in no doubt about that. Anybody who's ever read Aesop is in no doubt about it. 50%, as Richard told us, of the American public believe literally that the book of Genesis is fact. Exactly, but it's... But people who are going to defend Genesis and are going to stand up in pulpits and preach from Genesis must take some responsibility to disabuse their flocks of this literal mindedness. But I went further and said, we don't know what the Bronze Age herdsmen who first codified this particular myth believed. Maybe they did think it was literally true. And Richard Harris then said that stories can change their meaning as history goes by. As the centuries go by, we interpret them in different ways. That's sort of all right. I mean, I can kind of see that, but it worries me when an awful lot of people take them as factually true, and I sort of feel that at least some respect should be given to the intention of the original meaning. If Aesop had believed literally in the story of the fox and the grapes, and we said, oh, well, of course, Aesop, never mind what he believed, we take it to mean that it's the story of the sour grapes. I sometimes feel, I mean, let me give you a little allegory of my own. Suppose that at some future time, the double helix, the DNA double helix, is shown to be false. But by then, the whole of science has become so wedded to the idea of the double helix that they say, oh, well, of course, it's not actually true that there's a double helix, but what's the deeper meaning of the double helix? I mean, what's the symbolic, allegorical meaning of the double helix? Something about the twisting round of the helices symbolizes human love, or I mean, you could have enormous fun doing that kind of thing. but it would be kind of silly, wouldn't it?
I'm just looking to see if there's anyone of a different... Is there anyone up there who wants to ask a question? Can you... No, okay, right. You, sir.
I wonder if the bishop believes that God works through evolution to produce species. And if so...
Who is it? Could you put your hand up so I can see? I'd like to see who's asking the... Oh, yes, thank you.
I wonder if you believe that God works through evolution, Darwinian-type evolution, to produce all the wonderful species we have around us. Because it strikes me that there's nothing more cruel than evolution. And if God allows this, or encourages it, or invoked it, he cannot be a loving God. Because it's the cruelest way of producing species when he could magically have just done it the Genesis way.
Well, thank you very much. No, I think there are several very crucial issues. First of all, to be created at all is to be created with a life of one's own. And when God said, "Let there be," he literally did let things be, from the most elementary particles up to us with a life of their own. And not long after The Origin of Species was published, I think it was Charles Kingsley was the first person to say this, that God doesn't just make the world, he does something much more wonderful. He makes the world make itself. So I believe that the whole process of evolution is the world making it itself. Now, I think in pointing to the apparent cruelty of evolution, for me, that does raise much more serious and significant problems than the theory of evolution itself. I really do believe that it is the character of evolution which raises the fundamental question marks against a religious belief rather than the theory of evolution itself. On the other hand, we can say, and you've, I think, pointed this out in one of your books, that nature is not simply a competition to survive in the Victorian sense of red tooth and claw, because cooperation is built into nature as well as competition, and the ability of genes to cooperate within their own organism and organisms to cooperate within species is also a very, very important driver of evolution. And Richard will put me right if I'm wrong this, but I picked this up from one of your books. So it's not all red in tooth and claw. Cooperation is also a driver of evolution. But I do agree with you that in principle, it is the character of evolution which raises question marks against a religious belief rather than the theory of evolution itself. Have I got it right about cooperation? Would you agree with that?
I wouldn't say cooperation is a driver of evolution. I'd say cooperation is one consequence.
Right.
There's a chap standing up at the back there. Go on.
I was interested in the early discussion where we realised that many of the bishops are enlightened and understand the Bible and its connotations, but that the flock are way behind. Now, what I want to ask is, can we have an evolution within religion? Because at the moment, most services, be they Christian or Jewish or whichever, are a continuous mantra of praise to the most holy, but seem to say nothing philosophical of any great substance. Can't you reach to the religion? Can religion evolve?
Is this a question for you, Richard?
No,
well, it's a question about evolution. So, I believe that whilst certain fundamental truths do remain, a religious view of the universe does have to respond to new facts which are discovered and has to account for this and include them in an overall religious perspective on human existence. So there is a sense in which a religious view of the universe ought to be evolving all the time. And I suppose that's one of the reasons why whilst I don't think Anglicanism is the last word, that's an understatement, isn't it? I do believe that it is a church which on the one hand tries to remain true to the fundamentals of the past, but is open to the future and tries to be responsive to new truths as they emerge and to include them with an overall coherent and consistent view of the world from a Christian point of view.
I think we've probably got time to squeeze in one more question.
There's a,
Yeah, well, there's a lot of hand waving. There's a lot of hands pointing at the
young
same
man,
person.
a young
Yes.
man, yes.
Go on
A
then.
young-
Off you go then. Yes.
Thank you. The Bishop, you yourself talked about ages ago, in the time of Darwin before, most Christians, and indeed everyone really, didn't believe in evolution, rather believed in creationism, and before that they believed the earth was flat, and before that they believed in Behemoth and the dragon of the Revelations, and before that and other things which science has then gone to disprove. So as science pulls back what could be seen as the religion of the gaps or the God of the gaps, is it not impossible, is it possible that religion as a whole will one day be sort of pulled back as we do answer the questions of how life began, how the universe began? And furthermore, does it sort of imply that the slow chipping away at sort of the realm of religion, what it covers, means that rather than a sort of celestial inspired religion, we have a more naturally occurring phenomenon, which sort of the primitive man invented as a pseudoscience, rather than having a set of beliefs which is absolute. Because if you're constantly changing what should be a divine belief, does not sort of make us think that it is a belief which cannot be guaranteed.
Thank you for that. No, I don't think that religion is going to die out. I think that so long as we human beings are on this earth, we will go on posing questions to which religious answers are available, and there will be people who will believe those religious answers. I think it's absolutely fundamental to us as human beings that we do ask these kind of questions, and religions will remain there as offering people some of the possible answers which are available.
I think we can probably squeeze one more in before we have to go. Yes, you've had your hand up a while.
Literally wonders of the universe. I actually believe that we are involved in the meaning of this universe. Furthermore, I believe that religion is evolved as a group identity for survival reasons. That's how we formed it. I'd like to know what religion has to contribute. It seems to me that the understanding
Yeah, I'll repeat it for you in a second. So your question is specifically what does religion have to contribute to what?
Well, to the fact that we are genocidal animals.
Okay, fine. So what?
Most species in this world are becoming extinct thanks to our activities. What is religion? Science seems to me to have an answer, or the beginnings of an answer to understanding the new demand. It seems to me that religion has not yet made a real contribution to that at all. So religious people.
But religion hasn't made a substantial contribution to, or has no role to play in addressing issues of extinction and the rest. Yeah. Okay. Go on.
Well, it seems to me that if we're considering environmental issues, and particularly the extinction of species, what we bring to bear on it, whether we're atheists or religious or agnostic, is a moral concern about it. It's not science itself which gives you that moral concern. Many scientists will have a moral concern about the extinction of various species. So will religious people, so will non-religious people. But this is not a scientific question, it's a question about ethical responsibility. And religion claims, it's not always successful in practice, claims to enhance people's sense of ethical responsibility. Now, I do think that religions the monotheistic religions are to blame in some respect in this area, because the phrase in Genesis that human beings have been given dominion over the animals has been clearly taken by some people as meaning the ability or the right to exploit the environment in a ruthless and total kind of way. And people now are reinterpreting that to mean that human beings have been given a stewardship of creation. So that is one of the ways in which I think, in which religious people, Christian people, are now coming to a different interpretation of that particular phrase in Genesis.
Richard Dawkins, very quickly.
I'd just like to I think what you've just demonstrated, Richard, is that as the centuries go by, as the decades go by, we change, we become more enlightened, we move on, and you've stressed that several times. We all move on, whether we're religious or not. And so the ethic which says we now have stewardship of the earth, not dominion, is something which is secular as well as religious.
Yeah.
Now, you can, if you wish, having decided that on the basis of this shifting moral zeitgeist, you can then go back to your holy book and find verses that will support it.
Yeah.
But why bother? I mean, you've come to it through this shifting moral zeitgeist. We are all in this together, moral philosophers, legal philosophers, parliamentarians, journalists, just ordinary people. We agree about our shifting morals, our shifting ethics, our shifting politics. We don't need to go back to the Bible and find the verses that agree with our modern consensus. We can just forget the Bible and just stick to our moral consensus.
Richard, we're going to have to stop it there because...
Right, okay.
Can I just, on your behalf, thank both Richard Dawkins and Richard Harris for a very stimulating discussion. Thank you.